Welcome to Social Sessions. I'm very excited to introduce Sarah Armstrong, a distinguished guest on our podcast. Sarah Armstrong is a professor of criminology at Glasgow University, and her research is at the forefront of understanding prisons and punishment. With a keen focus on penal practices, policy, prison health, and portrayal of these subjects in popular culture, Sarah brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to our discussion. But that's not all. Sarah's intellectual curiosity goes beyond the confines of criminology. She delves into the profound concept of justice itself, exploring its multifaceted dimensions. What does justice truly mean, and how does it manifest in different contexts? Sarah's insights into the diverse experiences of justice are sure to captivate and enlighten our audience. Welcome to Social Sessions, Sarah.
Thanks so much, Sean. It's lovely to be here.
How are you? All right?
Yeah, I'm pretty good. I'm doing well, thanks.
Excellent. So I'm just going to kind of do... I always go back into the history of people, Sarah, just people, how obviously, I know you're from America and stuff. So how was your kind of upbringing? What was it like growing up in America?
Yeah, well, I'm from California. I'm from near San Francisco in the East Bay, and from a place called Richmond, California. And it's interesting because it's not unlike Glasgow. It's a shipbuilding town. Right. So one difference, though, is that it is predominantly a Black city. So it was part of the Great Migration where people were coming north looking for jobs, and they built a lot of ships for the U.S. So that's where I came up. And from that experience, I went to college and ended up getting a summer job working for kind of an NGO that was working on prison issues. And it was just a summer job at that time. Thought it'd be interesting to work on something prisons related, and actually never really connected the dots to working on for an organization that was trying to look at better, more efficient, less punitive ways of using punishment with my hometown, where the people I came up with were getting policed and stopped and searched. A number of people had police break into their homes. They were caught up in drug dealing. There's a lot of stuff going on in the neighborhood. I never fully connected those dots between the community I was living in and the overuse of prison in the United States and California, but gradually started doing that. And when I came over here, I began connecting those dots a lot more. So
is it kind of similar? Like, could you see similarities in the kind of like impoverished areas in California and then the kind of impoverished areas here? Was it similar, but like where you could connect the dots? Yeah,
it was similar. I guess the big difference, though, is the way that poverty and punishment are defined by race in the United States in a way that is less visible here. And it took me a long time, actually, of living in Scotland to see there is definitely a racial component, but that race doesn't have a color in the same way that the U.S. does, but there's a history, say, of sectarianism and of over-policing of certain communities from certain white communities, such as travelers or Irish people or Eastern Europeans and so on. So it was similar in that way. And I was coming up in California just as the crack epidemic was taking off, and just the way you could literally see that drug decimating communities, families, friends was unbelievable. Just literally just kind of people gone missing. And I gradually came to appreciate here that there is something parallel. At that time, it was heroin when I first came, but the drugs here also are like just a huge impact and driver of how criminal justice works. Oh,
definitely. It's a recurring theme that we have, obviously talking about drugs, talking about this kind of stuff. And the crack, it seems to be kind of hitting big here, Sarah, don't you?
Right.
There's a massive influx of crack. I don't know if it'll kind of be the same way as it was in America, because that was, I know that decimated like a lot of communities. I don't know if you've ever seen Dave Chappelle when he's talking about when it was a Just Say No campaign, but Dave Chappelle kind of makes a joke out of it, and he says like, because the choice of drug has changed now in America, and it's opiates over there or opioids, and he was kind of making a joke and saying, well, look at the way that they've kind of acted. It's saying because it's white people that are involved now, it seems to be a lot bigger issue. And it's not Just Say No campaign. There's a lot more kind of looking into it and what's actually happening. So do you think like obviously looking at the crack epidemic over there, do you think it was, as you were saying, similar to the heroin thing here, like maybe looking at the Edinburgh stuff, like
Yeah. I mean, I didn't realize that crack is making a comeback or coming in here, and yeah, that's interesting. You know, I think it was really noticeable to me too that when it was crack, it was a real discourse of hypercriminality, gangs. We need to criminalize this. 3 strikes laws were coming in. It was such a criminalized, punitive attitude, and all of a sudden, with opioids, it's a public health problem.
Aye.
It's largely white users who are being publicized or in the media, and it's a public health problem. Now, you know, that's kind of like on the surface. Beneath that, there's still a huge amount of criminalization, and there are many people who are in the jails and prisons of the U.S. today for opiate-related issues, whether that's selling, using, dealing, as well as for crack. But yeah,
the cartels have kind of changed as well. There seems to be like fentanyl and stuff like that.
Yeah. Like, you know, fentanyl is like the crack of heroin.
Aye.
You know, it's just the potency and the power of that is just unbelievable. Yeah, it's just that also too is tearing communities apart.
I think the statistics are showing that there's more people dying. I'm sure it's it's definitely in the top 5 for people dying opiate.
Yeah.
I don't know. Obviously, there's a few good programs in the dope sex out. The pharmacist, they all kind of showing these kind of things. But we'll delve back into that later on. It's just I'm kind of want to take you into a kind of own academic studies, Sarah, because I know that you've obviously got a really colourful academic background. So could you tell us about some of your kind of stuff that you've looked at, like some of your researches and stuff that you've done?
Sure. Interestingly, because I look at prisons in Scotland, that's a main area of research for me, is I hadn't in the past really done much research into drugs. And I see that now as a huge flaw in my approach to how I've looked at prisons, because if you want to understand prisons in this country, you really should be an expert in drugs and drugs policy, because I think fundamentally the Scottish penal system is a really expensive and really ineffective way of managing a drug problem.
Aye.
So I personally only started looking at that recently with a colleague of mine actually in Stirling. But before coming to Scotland, I guess, this organization I used to work for, we would go around the country trying to advise state and local governments on how to use prison less.
Aye.
And one of the places we went was, say, like San Quentin Prison in California, and trying to help them figure out a redesign or reuse of some of that prison. And, you know, I think you have an impression when you don't have any involvement with prisons of what they're like. You know, you think of your movies and your Hollywood versions. And in some ways, I think California prisons do have that aesthetic.
I know I've watched the programs.
They look like, yeah. You know, they've got like, you know, guard towers with guys with, you know, automatic rifles patrolling around the walls and stuff like that. They've got the clear prison uniforms is like the jeans and the t-shirts and stuff. And
like gang culture into it.
Well, yeah, you know, so there's like this representation of a gang culture, but actually, like when I went to San Quentin, and part of that was being involved with the death row, it's still just a group of guys who are coming from the same neighborhoods as you would expect from the people in prison here, who are also looking after each other, trying to make this artificial constrained environment somehow work and safe for them. So yeah, so I've seen a lot of prisons. I've seen a lot of prisons in Florida and in California, Scotland, New York. And, you know, I think sometimes people ask me, you know, how does Scotland compare? Like, are the prisons as hard here, or is they tough here? And I think, you know, what makes a prison hard or tough? Like, what is a dangerous prison? You know, if you look at it by body count, Scottish prisons are hard. Scottish prisons are hard. They have a higher death from drugs and from suicide than many prisons in the United States. Like, I think that surprises people.
No, I'm surprised to hear that.
Yeah.
We had Fritzi Hotsman on. She does the Compassionate Prison Project, and she was kind of saying that she was kind of looking at the differences, and she goes into a lot. She does I don't know if you've seen The Wisdom of Trauma, and so she goes into prisons and does a trauma circle, and obviously it's so glaringly obvious that when you go into these prisons, even in Scotland, when you do the circle, it's the same stuff, it's the same trauma that people are led to crime. Do you know what I mean? So I think we're starting to look more into a trauma-informed, but what do you think, Sarah? Do you think, from an academic point, do you think there's enough work going into trauma-informed stuff in the prisons?
I think, trauma is something that we've talked about before, had conversations about, and it's something that I have a really tricky, complicated view of when it comes to criminal justice responses. I think you're absolutely right. Like, my own experience of speaking to people, doing research with people in prisons in the US compared to Scotland, is it is the same kinds of backgrounds. People are coming from the same kinds of complicated life situations, neighborhoods. So their pathways might be the same. I think the problem I have with talking about trauma-informed responses or criminal justice systems being aware of trauma is I think that lets criminal justice organizations off the hook. Mm-hmm. I don't think we talk enough about how police, criminal justice social work are trauma-inducing and trauma-causing organizations. So I find it really hard to understand how an organization in which suicides have been rising for the last 10 years has just issued a trauma-informed corporate plan, which is, of course, the report that the Scottish Prison Service has just put out. How it could come up with something like a butterfly-shaped prison, which was its original design for the women's prison when it was meant to be in Clydebank. How you think putting people in a situation where they have no autonomy or control, where they're treated like animals, has anything to do in the same room as talking about treating people with compassion and care. I just don't understand it. Mm-hmm. So that's the problem I have with it. And when we talk about trauma and people in the criminal justice system, I think we tend to focus on the flaws, the failures, the weaknesses, the deficits of the people, and not the violence of the places that we're trying to deal with them in. And another factor of that is policing, and I don't think we can ignore that. I don't think there's enough of a critical conversation about the role of police in trauma and in creating demand for criminal justice services like social work and prison. We know over and over again, it's been documented that anytime a police has any contact with a young person in a deprived neighborhood, it increases their cortisol levels. Aye. Literally having the police say hello to you is increasing your cortisol levels. I don't understand how then the police can say, we are a trauma-informed organization and we'll try to be in better touch with the community about that, when your very presence raises stress levels. So, that's my response. Argument,
Sarah. I mean, obviously, we've had like James Docherty's been on here. He's a really, really good talker on trauma. Fritzy, also like really good trauma-informed. And it's they're coming from a different angle for you, Sarah. Yeah. And it's obviously this is what it's all about. It's trying to get opinions and trying to see where the flaws are and stuff like that. So would you say that there's more, they're causing the trauma more than we need to kind of, because obviously there's a lot of stuff with trauma, and when you go to the ground level, when you actually do go to the ground level of prison, I don't see any change. And I've said it I don't see like, it's all buzzwords, do you know what I mean? And you see certain things like Natalie's Recovery Cafe is brilliant, do you know what I mean? It's like, I've seen the changes that can make. But I also know people in prison who are lost still, who are way, way, way far from even going anywhere near a recovery cafe. And I just think, I agree with you. I know what you mean by the way that's the actual people that's causing the trauma. So how can they then be trauma informed when they've got, in a way, they've got to cause trauma? Is that what you're saying? Like, am I getting you right? They've got to cause trauma because that's their job.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to put like words in any individual's mouth. Like, I don't think every prison officer and every police officer starts their day saying, I want to inflict trauma.
No, of course.
I want to do violence. I think I'm talking about the organization, the institution of policing in prison, is that their jobs are inherently going to involve a degree of structural violence, symbolic violence, and trauma. And just as we were talking about, if Scotland's criminal justice system is really a really expensive way to address a drug problem, I would say the same thing with trauma, is if you want to deal with drugs, the best place to do that is not in a prison. If you want to deal with trauma, the best place to do that is not in a prison. It's not through a police officer. So why are we not focusing, therefore, on removing people from the criminal justice system? I mean, I've been in Scotland for over 20 years, and when I've been working on prisons here since 2000. I was stunned coming from California, where there is a death row, where there was a murder problem, that shoplifting is one of the most common reasons that women in Scotland were imprisoned.
I know.
That they're still being imprisoned for shoplifting. I don't understand why you would use a resource that costs you £40,000 a year to put someone in prison for shoplifting that often is reflecting a drug or alcohol problem. I just don't understand it. So to me, I feel like you were saying earlier, it just seems like things haven't changed much. When I came in 2000, we were still talking about we're imprisoning too many women. We're still talking about that. The prison population at that time was growing. It dipped a bit in the pandemic, but it's back up.
No.
Why do we have 3 times the prison population of Norway, of Finland, double the population of Ireland? The problem isn't what we do in prisons, like how can we make them better? And I'm not denying there's things in prison where people do find comfort, that people might genuinely find recovery while they're in prison. I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but I'm saying the bigger conversation is, why are we focusing on the people in the prison and not the prison itself? We use too much of it, and we're using it to address a problem it's not very good at solving. Like, why aren't we dealing with that?
No, I agree with you. I totally agree with you coming from, Sarah, and I can see that there's a great argument there. And obviously it is a different outlook. I mean, obviously Fritzi was saying you can't blame the prisons and blah, 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 stuff like that. And I totally get her as well. Like it's this kind of debate where who's responsible for the actions of that criminal? Is it as you say, like, if somebody's going through that kind of addiction, going through a drug problem or any kind of, they're going to commit crime. And when you've got a society who's kind of conditioned into a mass amount of trauma and stuff, like, you're going to have addiction and that following it. So it's a hot topic where you could say, I don't know, like, where because it hasn't changed. That, like, you're right, it's like you've been using all these kind of stuff, and it's still really the same as when I was in prison 2005, got out in 2020, and I didn't see any changes. I honestly didn't. And as you say, the prison, if it was getting better, the prison would be the rate of convictions would be coming down, the rate of the prison population would be coming down, the addiction rate would be coming down, and it's going up. Yeah. So no, I know exactly. No, it's obviously a good, and we'll probably go into it more as the podcast goes on. But I'm quite interested in the kind of topic of criminology, Sarah. So can you kind of explain what criminology is and like how like the topics it covers and stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I should say at the start that I feel like a fraud, like an imposter syndrome a little bit. I don't actually have a degree in criminology. I did my doctoral work on institutions, on juvenile institutions, in law. So it wasn't kind of technically a criminology degree. What's interesting about criminology is it is founded in the 19th century explicitly involving ideas about race and racial supremacy. So criminology is, if you had to choose any subject in the entire world that most has to do with racism, I'd say it's criminology, because it uses the idea of race and the physical factors of that, how far apart your eyes are, what your nose looks like, to try to decide whether you're criminal or not. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, that's the discipline I work in, is a discipline that was born in eugenics and racism and whatnot, and is looking for this holy grail of what gene, what eyebrow shape, what skull size will tell us who the truly evil, dangerous people in society are. And while I would say that criminology today has mostly shed those explicit racial elements of its reasoning, they're still present in other ways. We still use things like mugshots, or we're still looking for that genetic marker of, violence and criminality. So there's still that. And I'd say like the field of criminology now is almost divided in two. Like half the field is still looking for what are the causes of crime, whether those causes are biological, genetic, environmental, social, or structural. Whereas the other half, where I would probably position myself, is trying to understand who gets to define what crime is, and how are we responding to the thing that we've defined as crime, and what are the effects of that. So when you're talking about when you have drugs and addiction, you're going to have crime. Yeah. And when you have austerity, you're also going to have crime. You're going to have people shoplifting for food and whatnot. But where's the crime there? Who's the criminal who took all the money away from communities? Where is the crime? Because as yet, there's not been a single prosecution, as far as I know, around the people who put the cladding around Grenfell. And the people who said, well, we don't have to really regulate that. We can let industry regulate itself on how fireproof that cladding is. Where are the people who are being prosecuted for the crimes where banks have taken away mortgages or overlent on mortgages that they knew were never going to be good, so that people are homeless and now suffering all kinds of economic deprivation? So, so in terms of criminology, I would say it's an interesting field because it's almost like not quite two opposing sides, but very different enterprises. And I'm much more interested in the idea of how we come to define certain kinds of activity as a crime and other kinds of activity as not as a crime, even though they might have similar impacts, similar negative consequences for people. So,
obviously, it's we've spoke loads of times, Sarah, and like I know that you would kind of. It's obviously it would be a kind of a topic that people would probably disagree in the way that you would abolish most prisons and kind of do use other stuff, community orders, whatever. So I know that you can get a really good argument for that. So do you want to tell us a wee bit about that? Obviously, because I know that's kind of a field that you're interested in. The criminology is kind of how you would actually do away with prisons and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, it is something we've talked about, and I really... I really think it's interesting to speak with people who have direct experience of criminal justice, that most people who do have that experience wouldn't have an abolitionist perspective. And I have to say, I do now work with and from an abolitionist position. I do believe that abolition is like really the only possibility for me in terms of justice. That's saying something for somebody who's a professional criminologist who's worked for government, been funded by government. But, I am, after the murder of George Floyd in 2020, it really kind of crystallized for me, as it did for a lot of people, to see that what the state does in response to some communities is doing much more harm than help. So that's not to say that there's not really serious forms of harm and crime that's inflicted by people on other people. I don't think the state right now has any effective way of dealing with that. So like when I'm not somebody who says, let's use less of prison and more of community sentencing, because I think that's what the government's also saying, and that's actually just increased the populations of both groups. So I don't have the answer of like what is the perfect successor system to the way we run justice now. But I do know, after 20 years of looking at the research, not only in Scotland but around the world, that prisons don't get better when they get help or when they're the target of reform. And so, I can appreciate what Fritzi's saying around you can't put all the blame on prisons. Like prisons aren't the start and they're not the end of what's wrong with criminal justice. They don't get to say no to people coming in their front door. They have to take whoever comes. And there's much more activity before them, which is in the decisions of prosecutors and police and judges. So I think everybody's contributing to this expansive system of criminal justice, and I think in Scotland it's really interesting. I feel like the prosecution and the judiciary are not especially transparent, accountable organizations.
No. We've spoke before about this, and it's like, I sometimes think when you look at the three pillars of society, you've got the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, right? And the judiciary creates a lot of jobs, jobs even out with services, addiction services, and there's a massive amount of society with jobs employed round about the judicial system. Is it possible that they want to keep, or they need to keep, the impoverished in the areas that they're in, to keep that kind of cycle, going, to keep the jobs and stuff? I mean, if we eradicated crime tonight, Sarah, there would be a lot of people out of a job.
Yeah, no, including me. I mean, I feel like I'm one of the people who lives on the fact of criminal justice and crime. I'm employed in a university to teach that and to train people in that. So that includes me. I think what you're describing is what Angela Davis has coined as the prison industrial complex, is that prisons are wrapped up in a much larger carceral system in which everyone's making money off of it. And there's a lot of people employed by it. But some of those companies are just all the companies we use every day. Last time I checked, it was Virgin Media who was doing telephone and cable services in prison.
I know. Sodexo, a food company.
Sodexo is a food company. They do a lot of catering in hotels and resorts as well. So, anyone who can make money, whoever's selling toilet paper to prisons,
I know,
is making money off it. And I feel like, that's, yeah. What can we say about that?
No, I agree. I've said it before, and I think it's really interesting to look at transparency and the way that, it's cases now, like obviously King's Counsel and judges, High Court judges are like the only people who don't need to open their accounts.
Oh, is that right? I didn't know that. Okay.
They don't need to show their accounts. So Alex Salmond, when he was First Minister in Scotland, asked Lord Gill to come to a meeting about it, and Lord Gill just said no. And I think people don't see the elite position that these people are actually in. I think these people are in a more elite position than the politicians. Yeah.
Because they're not elected, or they don't have any sort of public facing.
There's absolutely nobody to answer to it. Even if there's a miscarriage of justice, they don't answer to it. They're not held accountable if an Anderson appeal, which is just like an appeal, if someone wins an appeal because they were misrepresented, nobody's held accountable. The caseloads that they've got are astronomical. During my case, I don't know how many times I had to say the names of the people that were involved. They would ask me continuously, what's his name again? And you're like, oh God, like, this is, like, you should know this name, surely. Do you know what I mean? It's like a big part of the case.
Yeah.
So my QC at the time was Gordon Jackson, and he was jumping from trial to trial. He was doing 2 trials at the same time. And you just have to, Andy was an MP, and you're like, what's happening here? Like, is this really? And it's such an elite position that they're in when you're in the top elite judiciary. I think it's like a club that, because to become a KC, Sarah, you need to do a thing called your diviling, which means you need to shadow a QC for 2 years, unpaid. So to me, that's to kind of get the working class people out of that bracket, so that the working class can never become at that elite stage. Who can afford to go 2 years without pay?
Yeah.
It's only somebody that's got money and comes from that kind of background. So I definitely think there's a huge industry run about prisons, and I would agree with you on that. What I would say is probably the viewers would say, so what would you do with Ian Huntley or Peter Tobin or something like that? What would you do with that? If you were abolished prisons, what would you do with people like that, Sarah?
I mean, that's... I think, the main thing is that I think there's shared ground between everybody is that something should be done. Mm-hmm. That if there's people who commit those horrific crimes, like you're talking, like those individuals, something needs to be done. What I would question is, why do we keep doing the thing that we know doesn't work? Like how, if you or I were running a business and asking investors to keep giving us money, saying, we've been running this business for 20 years and we've never made a profit. And actually the people who we give our nutrition bars to are just getting sicker. Can you give us some more money?
Aye.
And we keep giving you money to make that product. Like, why do we support that business model for criminal justice? That's what I'd say. So instead of saying instead of then you saying to the investors, well, what product should we make? Be like, I don't know. Like, we need to do some research on that and figure out what a better product is. But I do know I'm not going to keep giving you money for a company that's failing.
I know what you mean.
So, and
it's not like you've not got the full answer and the full thing, but you know that's not working. So why keep going down a road that's no working? Like,
and so what you were saying earlier though about who runs this system, are the judges and the prosecutors and so on, like who are the people involved in making the key decisions about this system and where do they come from? And I think the statistics back you up in terms of like the class profile and the wealth profile of people the majority of people who end up in those positions. I think the legal profession is aware of that. And I think they are working harder to do things like widening access to that. But I think even if you come from a more modest background and you get up to these levels of becoming a judge, that you get absorbed into that culture. Just like I have no doubt whatsoever that if I was working in a prison as a frontline prison officer, I would readily and quickly become part of that culture. Organizations are bigger than us, But what is really interesting in something you said earlier when you were saying that you had to keep telling your QC or your lawyer, the story of what your situation involved. To me, that's like a perfect example of the ways that criminal justice causes trauma. And you know yourself that you'll have had to tell your story or explain something about your background over and over and over again. You'll have to explain like the worst things that you ever saw services. Or, and the people asking you again. And every time you are told to recount that story, it is like redoing its damage on you. And they are allegedly going through that process to make sure they have accurate information and can make appropriate decisions and offer you the best intervention. But that's a kind of violence, And, on the other side, that's what survivors of rape have to do and why they complain about criminal justice, because they're having to tell the worst thing that ever happened to them over and over and over again. So when are we talking about trauma and criminal justice? I think that is just one of the small ways that criminal justice inflicts trauma. And I would agree with you. There is a class dimension to how it's organized. I personally feel like you shouldn't be able to sentence someone to prison until you've spent like a week or a month in prison yourself and just understand what it's about. Because I think, to me, there's a sense that we think prisons are safe because they don't look like the Hollywood version of prisons. And actually, prisons are really dangerous. And they're dangerous in the way they suck hope and life out of people. And they create conditions of distress and despair. And that was something, I don't know if you saw a few weeks ago, but Jill Emery, who I think she was the former inspector of constabulary, completely went to town to say the Scottish Prison Service is not safe. They are not doing enough around the safety and health of the people in their care. And she testified that to the Criminal Justice Committee at the Scottish Parliament. I didn't see much news coverage of that.
No. You never do. And obviously, I totally agree, because I know that I'm going to try and go into like the health kind of stuff that's going on in prison, and I know that you're kind of passionate about the suicide rates and stuff and the death rates that are in prison now, and they're quite sharply rising. So can you tell us a wee bit more about that, Sarah, the work you're doing in that kind of field with it, kind of, because at the moment, obviously, the new, what's getting pushed is prisoners are getting more human rights, and the MAT standards are going in. Now, the MAT standards have been in for a long, long time. People are just mentioning them now. That's medical assisted treatment. So it's like they've been in a long time. So they're just getting highlighted now. But again, when you talk to people who are in prison, there's no real change. I'm saying to people when I go to see them later, I'm going to you, do you feel more empowered? And they're like, you kidding on? Like, what are you talking about? Like, there's absolutely no even a mention of this in here. So it looks as if on the surface, these people are in Parliament talking about it, and it's all great sounding. But when you go to ground level and you ask the people, do you feel a change? They say no. And that's where it counts.
Yeah. It
counts at the ground level. You need to feed it. That's all right, but it needs to drip down to the actual and make the change that they're saying. So what's your kind of research kind of finding, Sarah, about the health stuff and the suicide rates? Now, what's findings?
Well, so over the last few years, I've been working with colleagues around just documenting the number of deaths in prison. So this year, we're going to be doing another briefing on how many deaths there are in prison. And it started because a colleague of mine had organized a round table for families affected by a death in custody. And it was an issue actually that I hadn't looked at previously or known much about. But in order to begin that research, we thought, well, what is the base rate of death? Like when, how, and why do people die in prison? And so the Scottish Prison Service actually publishes statistics on this, and it's very transparent in that sense. And when we started putting them together, we were able to map the trends. So in the 90s was a really intense period for suicides in Scottish prisons. And to some extent, there are a few drug-related issues, but drug deaths often followed when people left prison. Right. And then things started to fall a bit, but over the last, say, 7 to 10 years, rates of death have been rising significantly. Part of that rise is due to the aging of the prison population. So people are in prison for longer. So it's more likely they'll die in prison, but people are going to prison older. So historical prosecutions and are increasing the age of people in prison. So you're seeing a lot more health conditions death. That's one thing. But suicides are also starting to track up too. And that is something which is of huge concern because we know that suicide is just a tip of the iceberg. It's just the most extreme marker of distress and despair in penal environments. So that those numbers are going up, that we're seeing a lot of...
What kind of numbers are we talking, Sarah?
Well, so during the pandemic was an especially extraordinary year because it really spiked up. But let's say 10 years ago, you would have seen around 25 to 30 deaths in a typical year in prison. In 2021, there was over 50 deaths.
It's doubled.
Yeah. So and the drug deaths of that was a significant proportion. I can't remember the specific number now, but it was something like close to 20 people, 15 or 20 people. That's drug deaths.
Young boys as well.
Yeah. And you know yourself, like if there's a drug death, there'll be overdoses where someone was just saved in the nick of time. So the deaths is just one measure.
The blue lighting is, that's something that they talk about now in Code Blue.
Yeah.
When I went back to Adwell for Castle Huntly, I had never seen anything like the amount of Code Blues that were going on. It was like every day, like you would see one.
Yeah.
So is this causing more deaths then, Sarah? Are we starting to see? Because obviously I've heard of a few, but I'm not privy to the same kind of statistics you are. So is these like spice and the street volume and stuff, is that kind of causing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's looking at, like, if you look at the causes of death, atizolam is figuring in a lot of that. But a lot of it too is multidrug toxicity.
Okay.
So people taking whatever they can get their hands on. And again, you know, I mean, we could have
drug use is huge.
We could say, like, you know, it's a Scottish national problem. It's the way drugs are, you know, it's how drugs are delivered in prisons now. You know, I've had prison officers say, like, in the old days, people would just smoke a bit of cannabis, so you could smell it all around the prison, but it's not a lethal drug.
I know.
And now, if it's atizolam or whatever, and it's coming in on a piece of paper, it's coming in on a bit of clothing, it's harder to regulate.
And it's a drug that, even with heroin and stuff, people would take that kind of drug and just chill it.
Yeah.
The drugs that are now involved are making people violent, aggressive. So you're starting to see a lot more violence as well. I think the violence, you'll probably know better, Sarah, with stats and that, but I think violent attacks snapping up.
Yeah, I mean, I have seen some of that, and the Ferret has been reporting on that a little bit. They did some FOI, you know, those Freedom of Information requests, and we're looking at assaults and found some assault rates going up. And that's, I mean, I don't know if I would know better than you. It's like, I think the different sources of information help kind of triangulate and give you a better picture. But I mean, what you're hearing is similar to what I've heard from other people inside, is around prison feels less safe in a way.
Definitely.
On a day-to-day basis. At the same time, I'm also hearing, and I don't know if you're hearing the same, is that many prisons are still essentially acting like it's a COVID lockdown, and that they're still running weekend schedules so that people are getting locked up between 4 and 5, like every day.
Aye.
And not getting unlocked until the next morning, you know, 8:30, 9 o'clock. And so I think maybe it's both sides of the equation. Is how is the supply of drugs changing, but what is driving the demand, you know?
Aye.
And
escapism into it.
Escapism. And you know, it almost seems like, you know, it's ironic that the prison has just released its trauma-informed corporate plan, because it almost feels like the prison system's given up on trying to engage anybody or to support getting out of your cell, doing things. Maybe you're hearing something I'm not about what's happening. But
no. What I seen Natalie doing in the Recovery Cafe was amazing, but you're only touching a small proportion of, and it's trying to get people to engage. It's the people who, that's people who want to engage. Do you know what I mean? It's trying to touch the people who are the vast majority who don't want to engage.
Yeah.
The lack of trust in prison's huge. I always talk about it. There's no trust, so people don't want to go to anything because they don't trust that the thought process. And I said this to Fritzy, it's one of the terrible worst thought processes you can have, and it's think of the worst and anything else is a bonus. Now, if you constantly think of that, think of the worst, think of the worst, think of the worst, that's your mindset for 10 years, and anything else is a bonus. So you constantly just think, I'm not going to get that, I'm not going to get that, I'm not going to get that. So you end up, that is your thought process.
Yeah.
So how draining is that? How dehumanizing is that when you that's your thought process? There's no point in asking, I'm not going to get it, blah, blah, blah. If I do get it, it's a bonus.
And what about, I mean, I also feel like prisons is an environment where it's almost anything you do could be breaking the rules and get punished for it. So you'll have more insights than me about this, but how are you supposed to get to recovery? And all due respect to recovery cafes where they can get people participating, but how can you say, I've got a problem with drugs, and not have that count against you for your parole or your risk assessment or whatever else? It's an environment where you almost can't ask for help, even if you need it, and you have to lie about what your real needs are, and then you might get punished for lying. You know, it just seems like it's like this vicious circle. Like how is anyone supposed to get help in that kind of environment?
I think watching Berlini, and it's unbelievable that, and I think it's down to Mick Stoney, to be honest. He's the governor down there, and he is quite a progressive thinking governor. And I think certainly when I was there, the trust was coming because Natalie and other people had created an environment where if you went to the recovery cafe, they weren't holding it against you. It was going as a positive. I don't know how, like, we done a lot of work. It was like Natalie was in the background, and Natalie will always say it was us that done it. It was us that but Natalie was always, she's a fighter. She'll push for it. But we had Natalie on here, and I says, why are they not using this kind of system in all the prisons in? And it's down to each governor being what they think. Like, no, it's a lot of rubbish. I'm not going with that. Like, so everybody's getting told to put and go away recovery cafes and stuff like that, but some prisons are saying, no, we still want officers in there.
Yeah.
And as you say, you're never going to get, like, I was in Berlin and it was magical seeing what was happening. There was guys coming and the trust was getting broke. There was trust there. There was trust with a couple of the officers who were working there. Like, that they wouldn't go back and feedback what you were telling them. They wouldn't go back, and it was an open discussion, and it was private. And to my knowledge, there was never anybody go into trouble for going, or it was held against them. But why no roll that out into every prison then? I don't get why they even question, if that safe space is there, why no roll it out? And it's like, it depends on what prison you go to. So you could be unlucky and go to like Edinburgh or go to Glencoe, who don't really have that. So it's like, it's mad to say that Berlin is the most progressive prison in Scotland, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, you're right. Like, leadership matters. It creates the culture of a place. And, we saw research where there were some prisons in England that had never had a suicide in 2 years.
Wow.
And the researchers there really put it down to, there was a staff culture of, if they saw somebody struggling, there was trust. Mm-hmm. Because I think what can often happen is, if you admit to a mental health concern or you need help, if you get put on the suicide prevention strategy, like, nobody wants to trigger that policy because you get put in the safer cell, you get put in conditions that increase your risk of suicide. So this prison was like, they tried to manage it in a different way. And the prisoners trusted the officers trusted each other, and the management trusted the officers. So that does make a difference. I will say that within my abolitionist stance, that you can really change the culture. And, Mick Stoney was really welcoming to us too, because we went to Barlini during the pandemic and said, what can we do? Mm-hmm. We know people are struggling. We know they're isolated. And he supported us to do things like, we made a podcast with mindfulness and breathing exercises, and doing like a book drop and stuff like that. Those kinds of things. You really need a governor. You need someone at the top just to say it's okay. What I find really interesting, though, and I'm really curious to know what your thoughts are, is around the plans for the new Glasgow prison that's going to replace Barlini. And Mick Stoney was on the news about that,
I know, saying,
we need it. Prisons are dangerous. We need this new prison. And from what I've seen and the research that I've looked at, is new prisons are not safer prisons. If you look at the newest prison in the Scottish estate, it's Grampian and Addywell. Those are not the safest prisons. No. Those prisons have had a lot of problems.
No, very. I like Mick Stoney, so I don't really want to kind of talk bad about him. Like,
no.
I like Mick, and I don't know if he's being too hopeful in the way that HMP Glasgow is going to change everything, because I don't see that. I'd love to. I'm looking forward to seeing what they're going to come up with. What I think will happen is it will just be another warehousing factory within a couple of years. I think they'll try and put some. I don't know how you would. I don't know how they're going to. I don't know how it's going to be any different from any of the other prisons. And as you say, Addywell was certainly where I felt least safe when I was in prison. Addywell was pretty rough. And certainly when I get downgraded in 2020, I think it was really rough. Like, that was the worst I'd ever seen it. So I'm I don't know, Sarah.
Well, I mean, it's like it's no bad on McStoney at all. I think we agree that he's shown some really great leadership at Barlini. I think the only point that I would make that I think we agree on is that culture matters, the environment matters, and it's people and leaders who make that environment.
Yes.
You can have a good environment in an old, bad prison. You can have a bad environment in a brand new prison.
I know.
So
it depends on the people. I've said it before. There's like in prison, one person can come in and change the whole dynamics of a full prison.
Yeah.
And that, like you can move one prisoner for that, and that's maybe hard for people to believe, but there's people that you can move from one prison to that prison, and the dynamics will change, especially in halls. Like if you bring certain people into halls, the dynamics will change straight away because different things, the power that prisoners got, maybe the kind of whatever, do you know what I mean? Whatever that kind of thing is. So I don't know how you making a new prison is going to get rid of that. You're still going to have the same prisoners that are going in, the same people who have so much influence on a hall. So you could get guys in there that maybe are interested in going to recovery and stuff like that, but one guy will be like, it's a lot of shite, don't go to it. And that is what will happen. Yeah. Like people won't go because that certain person said don't go, do you know what I mean? There's people in prison with that kind of power. So I don't know how they're going to change that. I mean, I've said it before, I think Scotland's small enough that we could say you were to go to Berlin and it was like a introduction jail, and say, like, spend a month there and just say, like, what are you interested in? Like, are you interested in music? Are you interested in making podcasts? Are you interested in mechanics? Are you and have different prisons doing different things. And if you want to come in and just do your time and cause trouble, then you could have a prison for that. Do you know what I mean? Like people that go there. I mean, obviously it wouldn't be a very nice prison, but like I don't know. It's I don't envy the job of trying to change the prison system, but
yeah, what you're describing sounds great, and I just think, then why don't they do that? When they know that one person's presence is really disruptive, why don't they move them around? And I feel like that's not for us to answer, right? We don't work for the system. They have to figure it out. But simply building a new prison doesn't fix it. Just, it's just exactly what you said. Think about Low Moss too. Like Low Moss was the new prison at one point, and they would take everyone to do tours there.
Rough prison.
It comes off as a rough prison. Like the last 2 homicides were there, right? So, yeah.
That was something else. When I was in prison 15 years, and there was a lot of violence, obviously, seen it, but not to the extent that there is now, and you're seeing murders in prison and stuff like that in Scotland, which there's always been, but no to the extent of what's happening these days. I think the violence levels went up hugely, and I don't know if that's to do with drugs. I don't know what it's to do with, but it's certainly a recurring theme that we get with people talking about the prisons, is seeing that increase in violence.
I've heard that as well, and there could be external causes of that. There's stuff happening on the outside that's just going on the inside as well. But there's, I just am still wondering about managing prisons on a weekend regime where everyone's locked up for so long. I mean, that just seems like that's creating a powder keg. And, at one point in the pandemic, almost a third of the prison service was off sick, so I think absence levels in the prison service are still pretty high.
And I think they were able to release a lot of prisoners just overnight. So obviously those prisoners weren't that much. Like if you can do that, then
why aren't you always doing that?
Aye.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? If you can do that for a pandemic, and I understand it's different, there's a pandemic on, but you didn't release all the most dangerous prisoners. You released the people who you believed weren't a threat to society.
But the irony is, is that some of the people you might label as the most dangerous have the lowest, reoffending rates. Somebody who's committed a murder actually has a fairly low reoffending rate of, than somebody who's doing a lot of low-level crime, maybe to support a drug dependency. But, I was just looking at the statistics the other day, and every month the government reports how many people are getting remanded. And the most common reason people are remanded is for common assault, right? You kind of wonder about that. If it's like kind of fights at the club or whatever, is that a remand? I don't know. But the second biggest category of offenses that people are remanded for is called crimes against public justice. So that is, you violated bail, you've been disruptive to the police. It's like that is literally the criminal justice system manufacturing its own population. Like, what are these crimes against public justice? Is that a threat to the public? Like, if it was a threat to the public, it would have been a crime like an actual violent crime or something that threatened people. And
so if you're out in bail for shoplifting, you don't turn up to court.
Yeah, not appearing in court.
How's that?
Yeah.
And then you're going in, you're costing £40,000 taxpayers' money because you didn't show at court for a crime that is stealing a £20 bottle of vodka. Sarah, you make obviously a great argument, and it's definitely something that I agree with on. A lot of the stuff, looking at your perspective through your whole time in Scotland and looking at the whole landscape of the prison, what changes do you see? Do you see any positive changes in the prison system?
That's a really good question. What would be the positive change? The biggest positive change I would want to see is reduce the size of the prison population. And that's really like the one thing that hasn't happened. Like you say, during the pandemic, they let out, 300 or 400 people.
Right.
But that would be the main positive change. There have been positive things, and I think that's true, like the recovery cafes. I used to see some really amazing educational initiatives when New College Lanarkshire was involved. And, not just one-off poster projects, but just getting up the number of people who are getting Hires exam results or just, getting higher level qualifications. That's positive. I don't know. The prison system used to be a system where the leading cause of death was suicide by young people. That it's not gone back to those same levels, but it's coming back to those levels. So if you're asking me have I seen any positive change? Maybe a few initiatives in the past, but right now I feel like we're in a really dangerous phase.
I think a lot of people that work there, like Mick Stoney, Natalie, people have come on here and spoke and says it's broke, the system's broke, we need to fix it. I seen a post, a tweet by Kevin Neary just saying like they were releasing a 66-year-old guy into this and with nothing. And they were saying like that was aiding a bet that he was in with, and they were like, he was asking the question to the prison system on the tweet, what are you doing here? This guy is literally been released here with nothing. Now, if you do that to somebody who's powder kegged, a young boy who's up for violence, who's been brought around, you powder keg him, what's he going to come out like if you give him nothing? He's going to come out and commit crime to get whatever he needs, do you know what I mean? So, to me, I've said it before, and I know people disagree with it, but it does seem to be a revolving door system that we've got, and it's like there's a lot of money to be made in it, and I definitely think you need to look at the judiciary and some of the reasons why they're sending people to prison.
And when you talk about it being a revolving door system, or a system which actually is increasing the chances that people are going to come out and do something violent or dangerous, I think that is a really good way of framing things, because there'll be plenty of people who listen to podcasts like this or read The Sun or whatever who are like, lock them up and throw away the key. It's like, oh, obviously you all are soft on crime because you just don't care about victims. I kind of think the opposite. If you really want to hold somebody accountable, like this is the opposite of the system you designed, because what you designed is a system where people are going to come out more likely to commit crime, not less, more likely to be a cost on taxpayers' purses, not less. So part of it to me is about accountability. Like if people are doing great harm, they should be greatly accountable, but they should be accountable in a system where they're actually accountable, and the things we do now don't provide that. And they also don't help people recover from the institutionalization they experience. It makes them more dependent, less likely to be able to be part of the communities that they came from in a way that's not harmful. So it does seem like a revolving door system.
No, my experience when I came out, Sarah, I definitely just wanted away from people. I wanted to kind of just, I didn't really know how to fit in. It took me a long time to kind of fit in and see where I was going in life, and I'm making mistakes all over the place, and just kind of like getting, and now I've started, it's took me a few years, but I feel as if I'm starting to kind of get into the flow of things. But that's been like nearly 2-3 years that recovery process has took, and that's probably really fast. And obviously we know a couple of guys who are doing really well, but there's not a lot. Do you know what I mean? If you look at the actual population, there isn't a lot that are doing well.
Yeah, well, there's a really famous study done by Leslie Graham and a bunch of other colleagues who work in public health, where they looked at, I think it was 50,000 mortalities in Scotland and matched that up to people who had been in prison and people who hadn't been in prison. And they found that having any prison experience, like being in for a short sentence or a long sentence, increased your risk of mortality from all causes, from car accidents, from homicide, from cancer. And that was true even when you controlled for the neighborhoods they grew up in and whether they had a substance abuse or mental health issue. So their study seems to suggest that just being in prison makes you likely to die earlier. I'm not trying to, it's like smoking cigarettes every day for 20 years or something like that. And so,
I mean, if the research is there, Sarah, it's there.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's like, I think that's what it's saying. And it's sort of mapping onto what you're saying, that prisons themselves make people unwell. They make people less able to cope, and they inflict a certain damage that you need to recover from. And you're talking about it, it's 2 or 3 years and you don't feel fully recovered from it. I think that's true. And that's Definitely. Like not unusual. And I feel like a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about rehabilitation in our classrooms is students are talking about, what do people need in order not to commit crime again? And I, say to them, actually, a lot of the rehabilitative stuff that people need is to rehabilitate from the experience of criminal justice itself. It's not to rehabilitate to not commit crime. It's like you get older, and that is a really stable finding. When people get older, they stop committing crime anyway because they get married and have jobs and become less impulsive or whatever it is. So, that's really what rehabilitation is needed for, is for what we do to people once they get caught up in criminal justice.
So looking at the whole impact to kind of the criminal justice system, what impact do you think it has on like communities and stuff like that as a whole, Sarah? Like, see, as a whole, do you think that communities are affected by the way the judicial system works?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think we can see that in Scotland. We can see that in other places. There was some research done in my center several years ago by a researcher named Kath Murray, who's now got some kind of tricky things to say around gender. But anyway, she did some really good research on stop and search and found that police were stopping and searching young people in deprived neighborhoods of Glasgow at higher rates than was happening in London or New York. So the impact of criminal justice on communities is huge. It's taking people away from communities. It's taking people out of their support structures. It's taking people out of their housing. All the things that, We do. And, people used to say, when I did some research on short sentences, and people used to say, they felt like some sheriffs knew that after 3 months you lose your housing contract and would just put them in for 4 months, put them in just enough time to lose it. And I thought, that is such a vindictive system, we're not only are we putting in prison, but we're taking away every building block they have when they come out to succeed.
I remember watching a Louis Theroux program, and he says that he basically was talking to, I don't know if it was San Quentin, it might have been San Quentin, but they were in the yard, and like the guys who were kind of done with the kind of paedophile stuff and all that, they were in a wee group, their cell, and they were all holding Bibles and stuff, and the guys in the jail were saying they're only doing that so that it looks as if they're turning to God and they've changed and blah, blah, blah. But one of the guys was a judge who'd handed out a lot of sentences. He said like he'd handed out thousands of years of sentence, and I think he'd deservedly got a long sentence for something to do with paedophilia. But he said, I can't believe I was dishing these sentences out like as if they were nothing when I was a judge. It's quite hard to believe that I was doing this like regularly, just handing out big 20, 30 years sentences.
Yeah.
He says, looking back, and obviously it's looking at a guy, but he was a judge at one point, do you know what I mean? So it's interesting to see, even, it's as you say, I says that I think Hamza Yusuf should go into Addiewell for a month, and then even a week, go to Berlin for a week, go to every prison, you should and even spend time and go, is this, feel what's happening, feel that, because it's that it's trying to explain the undercurrent of that constant anxiety, that constant hyper-vigilant state that you're in. It's trying to take people, I know a lot of people, I was talking to Fritzy, and I love Fritzy, she's amazing, but a lot of the guys in there don't have the awareness to know that they can do better, if that makes sense. Like there's no a level of awareness for the impoverished guys to go, look, you're better than this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't know that there's any good stuff in the prisons. You get a few gems in prison, like Julie Thompson, people like that, who go out their way to try, but there's not a lot. Do you know what I mean? You guys came in and done the reading, and it's a wee bit of humanity. And that's the type of things that I think need to go on to give people back and show that, look, there is people who care, there is people who want you as part of the community, rather than total shut out. Yeah.
And I think it's one of the hardest things to talk to people about, or to convince them about what is the punishment part of punishment. I think the Daily Mail readers, they don't see it as punishment unless you're literally getting chased around with a cattle prod or something, or getting porridge all day. Just being in a prison is killing you. Like just being away from your family, your community, we now have the evidence, is literally killing you. The boredom is, and just like the dullness of it with what you're talking about, and other people have done a lot of work on that, is that constant level of keeping it together and bearing up under the day-to-day pressures that anything could kick off or something might happen. That stress level is grinding you down, surely but profoundly, every single day. Like that's the punishment. That is the documented level of punishment. And when you talk about, things that happen, like a really good initiative or program or something, I see that all the time, that there's something where people will talk about and say, it's like, oh, the one part of my week where it didn't feel like I was in prison, or where someone spoke to me like I was a person. And on the one hand, I think, well, that's great that some program or person was able to make you feel like that. And then on the other hand, I think, but what does that say about what we're doing? That this is a space where you mostly feel like you're not human, and you mostly feel like you can't be honest or open or vulnerable, So it's sort of like both a positive and a negative message to me. Is you're saying the best parts of prison is the times when you can make it less like what prison always is. I think this is not a tool of healthy societies.
No,
this is not like building safe communities and happy families.
I know. Well, when we were at the I was at the Gabbermatty conference, and I asked him a question about, he was talking about interconnection, talking about human connection, the need for that, and how that is the kind of antidote for trauma, is human connection. And so I kind of says, how do you create that interconnection in an environment that's very hostile, chaotic? And what he took a wee bit of time with the question, and he basically went back and he says, this is for a Holocaust survivor, and the Holocaust survivor had forgave the Nazis and what they'd done. And basically his words were about saying, you can only fix you if you want. Like you can only fix you if you're ready to be fixed. Then you'll go there. But basically saying I took it that it was basically saying you can't fix that environment.
Yeah.
You can only fix you. Like if you want to fix, you can do some inner work on yourself. But bar that, I don't, like you kind of was saying, there's no really any kind of. And
I think, like to me, a problematic interpretation of what he was saying then is, is the line that you do sometimes hear is like, the choice is yours. It's all about your attitude. If you want to change, you will, or if you want to survive or thrive in an environment, you will. And some environments make it extremely hard to do so, and I think obviously the concentration camps are one of those environments, and it'd be ridiculous to suggest to somebody, you can only change you. It's like that environment is literally only out to kill you. I'm not trying to say that prisons are the equivalent of the Holocaust, but I think they're also really difficult environments for people to make those choices or have the autonomy to make choices or to live a life in which they're thriving, not just surviving, but thriving.
The only people that I've seen thriving in prisons are people who are addicted to chaos and that are addicted to that kind of madness that goes on in prison, that they're addicted to chaos. So whilst they're in prison, they can excel in being whatever they're good at, like maybe violence, it may be aggression, it may be anti-authority behaviour, but it's all negative aspects that you would thrive in because the whole environment is negative. So if I went in there and I started going, look guys, we're going to do like some yoga today, and we're going to all meditate, and we'll listen to Eckhart Tolle and do the power of now, you would probably get a punch in the face and get told to shut up. Do you know what I mean? Like so it's hard. This is what I always say, it's trying to get that awareness into the prison. And me and James Docherty were talking about it, and we were saying, if you can make it mandatory to go and do a drug test, or you can make it mandatory to go and see social work, you could make it mandatory to go and do mindfulness for an hour in prison, go and get a wee hour to yourself, like you could do it. And if you don't get into it, you don't get into it. But some people, like, you could teach them yoga, teach them self-help in a place that is at times hopeless. You could make it mandatory. And I think the Philippines and that do it. See, like they've got Vietnam, I've got like an hour's worth where a couple of hours actually, I think, where they go and do yoga, they go and do kind of breath work, stuff like that. And it seems to work, but I don't think Scotland are nowhere near like even looking at stuff like that, I don't think.
Yeah, and that's complicated, right? Like you make it mandatory. It's almost like let's create kind of a punitive structure to enforce healing and self-care.
Mm-hmm.
Like I see it on the one hand of just not mandatory, but what if, the life of the prison was like they do in schools now, like the kids are running a daily mile or,
Mm-hmm.
whatever. So I see some of the benefits of that. But I also see just the way that's part of the logic of the prison is to have like rules and
Mm-hmm.
punishments for not following rules.
Mm-hmm.
And this whole kind of proportional logic doesn't work, but they just keep on trying to make it harder. If you do something wrong, we're going to punish you. And if you do it wrong again, we'll punish you harder. And do it again, we'll punish you harder and harder and harder. And even though that doesn't change your behavior, we're just going to keep ramping it up. But what if you did the exact opposite? Is if you do something dangerous or offensive or that is disruptive, what if we like embraced you lovingly? What if instead of trying to do it all with stick, what about more carrot? Like, what if we treated you like a human being where we could see like, oh, somebody acting out is obviously, expressing some level of distress. They need to be given resources and support, not more punishment.
Aye.
Like how would that change the dynamic? But I think the dynamic's already so punitive because that was exactly what the logic of the Barlini Special Unit was say, we've got this group of people who we can no longer control. They've just like taken it to the limit. We don't have any higher form of punishment because we've already given it. What do we do? And some psychoanalysts said, well, what if we just treated them like human beings and let them run the show? And guess what? They acted like human beings, We
actually had David Heyman on here. David was played Jimmy Boyle in A Sense of Freedom. So David was on and he was talking about the special unit and he used to go in quite a lot and he used to run acting classes and he said like he would go in and he says I was amazed at the level of intellect that the prisoners had and the level of creativity that they had. He says and the change was enormous and these were like your worst prisoners, like the ones that were like up in the cages and Inverness and uncontrollable, and the next thing they're controllable. When you give them control, they're controllable, and that's like a grown-up model of engagement instead of like a child on the naughty step level of engagement. And I think the prison service often works with the authoritarian parent model instead of what if we treated them like adult and expected them to act like grown-ups. What would they do? And actually they do stuff that is really interesting and you see some potential, something we're saving there. Aye. Well, Davey says that like the most powerful scene in the film was when the officer went up and gave Jimmy Boyle like a metal knife and fork. And that was like the end of the film, he says, but that just showed like you broke like the trust that he was actually took aback by, they're trusting me here. So it's like, I think is it Raphael Rao, the guy that, if you ever seen him, he goes about, I'm sure it's Raphael Rao, he goes about all the kind of prisons, and so he's been to like Venezuela, he's been to like all the different kind of prisons, but he goes to Norway on the last one, and when he gets off the bus, obviously, and he's expecting like all the different ways he's been kind of curtailed in Russia and all that, but he gets off the bus, and they're like, hi, how? And he says it totally took me off at guard. He says, and it made me, it's hard to be known, it's hard to be bad to somebody that's been nice to you.
Yeah. It's like, it's not that hard, right? But they're like, why there has to be this logic of, oh, we have to be tough and treat you badly because you've done a bad thing. It's like, yeah, but the punishment is just being here. It's not how you're treated here.
I know people say that there's no punishment in prison when that's so much a lie. Like, I don't think anybody, if they were to spend a week, bar your, like some of the most heinous killers you would get, but I think a lot of the public, if they spent a week in the prison, would go, whoa, that's so toxic.
And I think that people would see how much mental health and drugs explain why there's a full prison system, that it's not crimes that are really endangering the public safety. And speaking of Norway, everyone loves Norway, right? Norway, the prisons that, they do it right.
The gold standard.
Yeah, I don't know. I've got my own thoughts on Norway, but Finland, they in the late 80s, early 90s, they had the same prison population as Scotland. And they looked at it and they said, we need to take this down. We're dealing with an alcohol problem here. That's what they were dealing with. This is not an effective way to do it. Prisons actually are not good for societies. They don't make people better when they come out. We need to reduce the prison population. And they did it through a series of changing their sentencing laws, focusing on alcohol interventions, the rest of it. Their prison population, 20 years ago, the Scottish prison population was, 5,500, 5,800. Finland wasn't so different. The Finnish prison population now is like 2,500 people.
So they've halved it.
They've halved it. And meanwhile, Scotland's grown. We went to 8,000. We went to 8,000, and then it dropped in the pandemic, and it's coming back up again. So,
and obviously, if you're building a new jail, I don't know how much HMP Glasgow holds, but to me, when they build a new prison, the prison population goes up.
Yeah.
It doesn't come down.
It's like Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come.
I know. Aye, definitely. Aye, get the baseball bat.
Exactly.
No, definitely. And I agree with you. I don't see... I honestly would love to see like this, like progressive prison, and I hope I'm wrong. I really do hope I'm wrong. I hope that this is what happens. I really do. I'm skeptical. I'm just I've seen too much of this is the new change. Adderall. I mean, you go to Adderall, it looks like a college. Do you know what I mean? But inside, it's a hellhole. Yeah. And people go, oh, it looks like. I remember people used to come out to the visitor and go, it looks lovely. It actually looks quite nice in here. And you're like, you could put us in the Marriott. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I mean, you look at migrants who are being housed in hotels, right? And people are just losing their rags over that as they're getting 5-star hotels and stuff. It's not a 5-star hotel if you're locked in your room and you're only allowed to come out 3 times a day for, like a ham sandwich on dry bread. And
it's probably a lot cheaper than keeping them in the prison.
Exactly. And again, these hotels are making a lot of money off of it. So anytime I hear someone complain, we lost our booking because they took the migrants, it's because the hotel decided they could make more money that way. So it's not the migrants' fault. But, a gilded cage is still a cage.
Definitely.
And the level of distress and suicide and danger in those sites is no different than in prisons. So, I mean, I don't think I'm a cynic. I think I'm a realist. I don't think building a new prison fixes the problems of the old prison. And I think it just increases the capacity. Will they even close Barlinnie once they open Glasgow? I don't know.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I'll be very surprised if they do. But
and then will the new prison will be kind of like the Gucci option. That's the prison you go to if you're good, but we're sending you to this prison if you're bad. It all becomes, prisons are like a token economy of incentives and punishment. You play ball the way we want, we'll put you there. You don't, you go there. Everything's...
But I think it's so... you just scratch the surface and it's so fake as well. Like, even the tick box exercises that get done, like... Guys are just telling them what they want to hear, and they're wanting you to kind of move on and get you. So it's like there's no actual real substance to the change.
And actually that's one of the reasons that I've stopped doing research in prison. I don't think I will, I'm saying this now, I don't think I will do research in prison again, because I feel like some of the research I have done in prison is that people have been put forward. It's like the same people get put forward or volunteer for this, and you don't really hear from the people who have got something to say.
No, it's definitely the truth.
I don't know, like what your experience is, if you've ever been in any prison research or whether you've seen it go by, but...
No, I see, like when Fritzy was on, Fritzy was talking about, she thinks that Scottish prisons are a lot better than American prisons.
I hear that all the time. I'd like to hear why.
I know, well... obviously, I'm only going with what I watch on telly and watch like the Hollywood versions, and as you say, and the American prisons look a lot rougher. But I've got absolutely no doubt that when Fritzy came over here to do the ACES conference, that she would have been given the best,
the gold-plated tour
prisoners. She wouldn't have been given the real back. And it happens all the time. I've seen it in Scotland so many times. When the inspectorate comes in, they'll go and get the guy who is ready to move on and is chasing the Castle Huntley and stuff like that, and they'll go away, it's great, and it's so fake. Like, I think honestly that, and I've said it when Natalie was here, that the cafe was the best thing I've ever seen. I have, honestly, and I think it was just because it was like what was getting created was a rehabilitative setting.
Yeah.
a restorative setting where people were coming in for the community, treating you like a human. You weren't in prison for that day when you were doing it at the recovery cafe. Mick Stoney was great in the way that he says, look, obviously the security fought for it. They wanted officers in the thing. We said, look, nobody's going to be open and truthful if that's the case. They allowed it. They allowed us to go into a room which was quite advanced for like the way they usually do. So that was like, I think I just seen, it was amazing. She's just seen that change in people in the way that people, and I put it down to trust, Sarah.
Yeah.
I think trust is everything. If you go into prison, you've got a drug problem, you know it's going to hold you back. You're not going to be truthful with it. You're not going to tell them, like, I've seen people and I've sat on courses with people when they're saying, so what were you like when you were outside, were you committing crime? And guys are like, I done this and I done that. And you're just like, your report's going to be terrible. You're not going to get moved on. And then you'll get the guy in the corner who's just sitting going, nah, like I've never done. Who has been involved in crime, do you know what I mean? But he's just saying, so it's a shame where there's no real substance to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I just think there's a certain script you need to stick to if you want to progress, if you want to move on in a sentence. And everybody knows it, and everybody knows you have to stick to it. And if you don't even say you're sticking to it, you're going to have problems. And that is not how people recover from the problems they do have. Like, I think we all know that too, right? And so it's extraordinary that you are part of an experience where you could create a level of honesty and trust. And that's only possible if people in the room don't feel like the information is getting written down is going to turn up in a dossier somewhere and used against them. Because you can only heal if you're able to own up to
be truthful
and be truthful to yourself and to others. And that's not something that's rewarded in the current system. Can you make a system that does that? You know, I think maybe we differ because I've got strong doubts you could do that on a system-wide level. Like, I think it exists in pockets.
I think I don't know. I've seen certain people like doing amazing things. Do you know what I mean? Like Natalie and like James Docherty and people like that. I've seen people doing amazing things in prison, but it's how do you do it on a wide scale? How do you do it on the? Do you know what I mean? It's like
I think it's hard to do on a wide scale. You're like, yeah, how could you do that? You know, and there's always going to be, just like you talk, you know, there's always going to be some staff who don't believe it, who think people are playing at it. Right. And if people don't support it, you know, it's just going to be fatal. You know, it just will not get anywhere. And I'll stick to it. I'll stick to it. One prisoner changes the dynamics of the whole group. So you could have a group that's open to looking into change, looking into healing, and one person will come in and it could change. 20 people will just go silent and just like no talk. Do you know what I mean? How do you tell that person? Because that person's just as he's entitled to just as much a chance as the other prisoners. So how do you differentiate between getting the prisoners that are willing to try and change and then the ones who are going to disrupt it? How do you manage the disruptive ones? Well, I mean, yeah, who knows? That's like group dynamics, right?
Totally.
You know, and that person needs to be removed from the group or needs to kind of be educated or brought into the group's culture and ethos. And if they can't have what you do, and you know, the irony is, like, you're talking about in prison, right? I'm like, that happens anywhere. Like at university, like you're saying that, I'm thinking about meetings where like somebody take that one person and we'd get everything done we need to do, like just the one person. So it's in every walk of life, you know, and I guess it's ironic how many, when you say stuff, I'm thinking about my workplace. And I'm like, if I had the magic to know how to remove that person, I would do it. You know, and it's the same. It's like, you know, people, you can get things done when people are able to be honest and truthful and when there's trust.
Totally.
And you can't when there's not.
trust is the big thing that allows manifestation to take place, and allows healing, allows the kind of the seeds to be sown to heal. Trust is like rooted in that, like so much. So just as we're coming up to the kind of end, Sarah, of the podcast, just a couple of wee things. So see, just if I could give you a magic wand, right, and I could say to you, right, what would you put into the prison system that's no there now?
It's not what I'd put in, it's what I'd take out, right. I think, so we're talking about 8,000 people in prison in Scotland, 7,500, 8,000. That's who's there today. That it's turning over how many tens of thousands of people. Those are people who need help and who need accountability, and neither of those is happening. Can you imagine the amount of residential drug treatment you could buy with the amount we're spending on a prison system?
Have you got any idea how much it is yearly?
It's around £1/3 billion a year. So
wow.
It's 300 plus billions per year to run the prison system. There's another huge chunk of money that goes into the pensions of the staff who work in that system. Police on top of that is a huge amount of money.
And if you put the judicial system, the KC, isn't it? It's something around £1,500 an hour.
Yeah. And that's even with an underfunded legal aid system, right? So imagine putting that into communities. Like I remember with austerity, in 2008, one of the first things to close, I know because, a friend of mine was like a yoga teacher, was running free community yoga in the East End of Glasgow. Funding for that just got cut. Like, if you go up to the average person on the street and say, here's £1 million, how can we invest it to make communities safe and healthy? I guarantee you not one person's going to say build a prison. I think they're going to say, put it into parks, put it into community centers, put it into school support, put it into family support, put it into, they would say everything but criminal justice. And yet that's the one thing that it's like the last line of cuts will come to criminal justice. Everything else has been cut first. So if I was to wave a magic wand, I would say like, if Scotland is serious about taking a public health strategy to drugs, prisons and policing is part of that. Prisons and policing are not a public health strategy, no matter what is being told to us about trauma-informed interventions. Actually put it into public health. That would be my magic wand.
So just a wee final question, Sarah. So what about your legacy in Scotland? What would you like to leave behind?
I'm like, I know, I already am feeling old.
What would you like? Just because you say like you're coming up to like finishing your prison research and stuff, what would you like your kind of legacy to be within the system? Like what change would you like to think you've made?
I don't know. That's a great question. That's a good question. What do we want our legacy to be? I hope that I am helping to put information in the public domain that helps people themselves have a voice and fight for the changes that they see important to improving their communities and their lives. And at the moment, I feel very honored to be involved, for example, with the family of Alan Marshall. Their 8-year-long search for justice for Alan, who died under restraint by prison officers in Edinburgh. And
are you looking for people to come forward with that?
Yeah, I think the family is now fighting as hard as they can to make sure there's some accountability for that. I think most people know that all of the officers involved in that restraint got complete immunity from ever being prosecuted for anything that might arise in relation to that. So they are now...
So is there prisoners in the hall that's seen that?
Yeah, so it's the prisoners. We're looking for the prisoners in the hall who saw or heard anything to do with that.
And when was this set up?
This was in 2015 in Saughton. And Alan was held, he was taken down to the segregation unit at one point, but he was also in a regular hall. And some of those people who are on the halls with him have come forward and are willing to talk. And I think that would be really important Because now the one way to hold anybody to account is to find out what really happened. And the Crown Office right now has changed its position and is investigating potential liability of the prison service for a corporate homicide. So
that'd be a first.
That would be an absolute first, and it would kind of create some system accountability and maybe work towards changing the culture a little bit for the way people are treated and when restraints are used, that people having a mental health crisis, that you shouldn't get the death penalty for that. So, that's my legacy, is actually to, moving away from, I'm no longer involved in the business of trying to advise government to tell them how to, tweak things to slightly change them for the better, or for them to take over discourses and movements like trauma. I'm actually would like to help the communities and the people and the families most directly affected, whether as victims of crime or as people who are caught up in the criminal justice system, to actually make changes that make lives healthier and safer.
Brilliant, Sarah. And I think you're doing that. Obviously, I've seen some of the work, and I've seen the work you've even made, like with Karen and stuff like that, put in the work that you're just open to kind of helping anybody. And you've always been a big help to any of us that's come out of prison. So I'd love to thank you for that as well. But no, thanks for coming on Social Sessions, Sarah. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's been great. We've had so many chats about this stuff. It feels like more like this is the official version, but I don't regret anything we've said, and I appreciate being able to have this conversation with you here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah.
Thank you.